Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end-of-life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today, we're going to talk about a deeply personal subject, the grief that comes after a loved one has died of suicide. Many of you know that a significant influence on my becoming an end-of-life doula was the suicide of my cousin. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this conversation might be upsetting for some, and it's okay to pause and take care of yourself if you need to. My guest today is Joanne Harpel, a suicide bereavement specialist. In 1993, she lost her brother, Stephen, to suicide. And since then, she's dedicated her life to helping others who are walking through the same kind of loss. Today, we'll be talking about what it's like to lose someone to suicide, how it impacts different communities such as LGBT, children, spouses, and how we can support those who have lost someone to suicide. So grab a warm drink, settle in, and let's talk about this difficult subject. Joanne, I'm so grateful for you being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to start out by saying how sorry I am for the loss of your cousin.
Thank you.
What was your cousin's name?
Heather.
Heather.
Thank you.
So this is in honor of Heather and Stephen.
Thank you. So can you share about your own personal journey with suicide loss and how it led you to do the work you do today?
Sure. So in 1993, I was a corporate lawyer in New York City. I was 29 and I had no particular thought of making any kind of career change at all. And my younger brother, Stephen, took his own life. Steve had been an honors graduate of Yale, had gone on to Harvard Law School, was married to his college sweetheart, and was so popular that he had 11 groomsmen at his wedding. But at the age of 26, he very suddenly and unexpectedly developed bipolar disorder. And although we tried very hard to get him the best help we could, we ran out of time. And from the time he was first diagnosed until the time he took his own life was less than a year. And I took stock of my life and did a lot of my own healing work, did a lot of support group work, did a lot of therapy, did a lot of reading, did a lot of my own healing. And during the course of that healing, it became more and more clear to me that although I was a good lawyer, I was never going to be a great one because my heart wasn't in it. And I made a decision to start the process of a really big, very significant career change. And one moment in that was a healing conference for survivors of suicide loss that I attended on what is now International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day, which is always held on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. So it was just a couple of months after he died. I went to my first conference, and I'm sitting in this big auditorium, and I'm listening to the speakers at the front of the room who had all lost loved ones to suicide. And I remember so vividly thinking, I'm going to do that someday. I don't really know how. I don't really have any idea what the path is going to look like. But I just had this gut feeling that that was what I was going to do with my life. So it was a process that, like most major life transitions, occurred in a series of steps, not all of which were planned. One of the very first things I did was I went to the bookstore and I bought every book I could find with the word suicide in the title. There was no internet then. It was the mid-90s. So I didn't have the luxury of a Google search. I actually had to go to Barnes and Noble and go to the shelf labeled death, of all things. So on the death shelf, I bought every book that there was on suicide and suicide loss, and I learned as much as I could. And I noticed that in the back of each book, in the list of resources, there would there was an organization called the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that was based in New York City, which is where I was living and working at the time. So I cold called them and I said, I am a lawyer in New York City. I lost my brother. I'd like to get involved. Is there a place for me? Can you use me somehow? And I ended up getting involved first as a volunteer, and I was involved with them that way for a little while. And then they asked me to join their national board of directors. It turned out that AFSP was not just in New York, although it was based there. It's actually a national organization. And so they invited me to join the national board. So I was on their national board for a few years. And one of the decisions we made as a board was to create a new position on the senior management team of the organization, specifically focused on survivors of suicide loss, focused on what happens after there's a suicide. And they called me and said, what would you think about moving over from being on the board to coming to the organization in this new role that you and your colleagues just voted to create? And I said, sure. But at that time, I had a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. And I said, I can really only work part-time. So if that's okay with you, let's try this. So I ended up moving over from the board and joining the organization, and went on to create everything that they now have focused on survivors of suicide loss. And in 2013, actually this week, in 2013, I left AFSP to create my own practice, Coping After Suicide, in part because I wanted to work more directly with individuals who had lost a loved one. I had developed a lot of programs that were reaching a lot of people nationally, but what was missing for me was the opportunity to really connect on a more personal level with people who had gone through this loss. So in 2013, I created Coping After Suicide, as well as a small sort of collaborative companion nonprofit organization called Rethink the Conversation, to be able to raise money to do some of the bigger projects that I wanted to do.
With both, I'm not going to call it a business, but with both passions. Well, one is a business, the other one is not. But you offer so much help to people, and you've so many resources, from webinars, which are free webinars that people could really learn from, and different courses also, and so it's. I really appreciate that website because I learned from it also.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that was so helpful for me when I was particularly in the early years of my grieving, suicide was not a subject that I knew much about. And frankly, it's not a subject that most people know much about. And then it hits you in your own life, and it's so bewildering, and it's so confusing, and it's so scary. And so part of what I want to do is help get good information and education out there to people who are trying to cope with it in their own families, to help them understand sort of how they fit in the overall arc of human experience, because suicide is really hard to deal with.
Yeah, it is. And I think that it's in our society, we don't like talking about death or aging or, any grief. And we don't learn about it. We don't learn about it in health class. We don't learn about it in our psychology classes, really. And suicide is just even a bigger taboo. So what we really see is what we see on TV, which, death and grieving isn't portrayed well on TV or movies. And suicide is not portrayed also very well. So that's what we learn from. That's how, so it's unfortunate. We don't have those real conversations that are needed.
One of the things that I sometimes do when I facilitate suicide bereavement support groups is I'll ask the group, the day before your loved one died, if a Martian had come down from outer space and said to you, tell me about this thing called suicide that you have here on Earth. Who kills themselves and why does it happen? And how do you know whatever information you know? What's the source of it? And so everyone in the group will answer with the understanding that they had about suicide before it had personally touched them. And most people will say something like, I don't know, I hadn't really thought about it, or it was something that people with depression do, or it was something that only people who are really, really troubled do. And how did I learn about it? I don't know. I probably, I'm not even sure. There's such a lack of information. And then when it happens to them, their explanation for suicide is so often, I did something wrong. I failed my loved one. It was something I said or didn't say, or something I did or didn't do. And the emotional weight of trying to make sense out of something that has such a strong emotional component to it without any actual information is a really, really difficult thing.
It definitely is. Now, after Stephen died, what were those early days like for you, since we're talking about the surprise of suicide and how people really learn about it? What was that like for you?
It was a mix of a lot of things. It was first and foremost just overwhelmingly sad, so heartbreaking. And I came from a family that had a lot of complexity in it already. My parents divorced when I was very young. And so there were a lot of interpersonal conflicts and very different styles that different people in my family had. Not great communication between and among certain family members that I was then caught in the middle of. So there was a lot of just straight up grief. There was a lot of bewilderment and confusion. There was a lot of interpersonal and sort of family politics going on. And there was a lot of trying to figure out, how am I going to get through this? What is the way forward? And I remember calling my therapist and saying, all right, just tell me what to read. Tell me what to do. What's the syllabus? How do I ace this? And she said, yeah, there's time enough for that. For right now, it's just about getting through each day as it evolves in its own way and in its own time. And there isn't any way to sort of power through it. Grief is not like that. And that was not what I wanted to hear at the time, but it was absolutely true, that grief has a rhythm and an evolution that's very organic, and we don't get much say in how it unfolds.
Yeah, it's amazing in our society. Again, as you said, we power through things. We like to take control. We are a group of people that we're highly independent, and we figure it out. We get through it, and we become winners. We power, and grief is you don't get over it. And there's no control.
And sometimes there isn't even any making sense of it. It just is. And so when I'm working with my clients, what I always say to them is, you will always have a relationship with the person who died. The relationship is different because they are not here physically. You will always have a relationship with them, and you will also always have a relationship with the grief. And those are not the same thing. The grief is its own persona in your life now. And just like any relationship with an actual person, there are days that you get along better, and there are days that you don't get along very well.
I'm just going to, I am taking a course through coping after loss. And we talk, one of the things that I found really fascinating, and I just loved hearing this, was, we treat the person holistically, or we engage with the person holistically. We're not engaging with, that person grieving. We're not engaging with the grief. We're engaging with the person, and we're talking about the person that they lost. And again, we're not talking about the suicide. We're talking about the person. So when as for instance, when I talk about Heather, I'm not talking about the suicide. I'm talking about the good times we had, or sometimes not the good times we had, but I'm really focusing on the person and that relationship that we had and continue to have. Just like you say, you have a relationship after the person leaves.
That's often the very first question I ask when I'm meeting a new client for the first time. If they don't have a particular place that they want to start the conversation, I will typically say to them, introduce me to your person. Who were they in life? Do you have pictures you want to show me? Who were they as a human being? We will get to and spend a lot of time talking about how they died and the circumstances and what it's been like for you since they died. But let's start out with remembering that they were a three-dimensional, 360-degree human being with favorite foods and annoying habits and experiences that you shared. And let's bring them into the space with us.
Now, how do you think that the grieving process for suicide loss differs from other forms of loss?
So in some ways, it doesn't differ at all, right? In some ways, loss is loss, and the pain and the emptiness and the ache that you feel from in my case, the Stephen size hole and Stephen shaped hole that is in my life is not different than it would be had he died from any other cause of death. But there are certain aspects of the emotional experience of losing someone to suicide that, while they are not necessarily true for every single suicide loss survivor, they are so common as to be pretty close to universal. So, for example, in all of the thousands now of survivors of suicide loss that I've crossed paths with over the nearly 25 years that I've been doing this work, I've yet to meet a single one who wasn't grappling in some way with the question, why? Why did this happen? And for some people, that question is a very literal one, where they're replaying their loved one's last hours or days, weeks, rearranging all the different puzzle pieces, rehashing the chronology, trying to really understand why this happened in a very concrete way. For other people, that question of why is an existential question. Why? How did the universe, how did God, how did this happen in a sort of a cosmic way? And for most people, it's a little bit of both. So that question of making sense out of it, and usually the effort to make sense out of it includes a big dose of, where do I fit in? Did I have some role? Was I culpable somehow? Did I say or not say, do or not do something? What does this mean about the relationship that I believed I had with this person? Did I actually know them? It also very often includes a dose of, who else might be culpable? Who else might I be angry at? Trying to reconcile the fact that the person that you miss so much is the very same person that killed your loved one. And that is a complicated thing to somehow try to understand, process, and make peace with. So the whole broad category of why did this happen, and who am I holding culpable, and how do I feel about that person, whether that person is myself, the person who died, other people, third parties, that consumes a lot of grieving after suicide in a way that is not automatically part of grieving other kinds of losses. And the other thing is, for most people who lost someone to suicide, there is a very strong drive to create a narrative, to put all the pieces together in a way that makes sense. And the narrative, the story we tell ourselves about the suicide shifts and evolves and changes, sometimes during the course of a single day. And the narrative that we're living in has a really big impact on how we feel. So the days that my narrative is more focused on, my brother had a very, very serious mental illness, and we think he stopped taking the medication that the doctor had prescribed for him. When that is the primary part of my narrative, it feels very different from the days when my narrative is filled with all the ways that I feel like I failed him as a sister. And so for most survivors of suicide loss, working their way through finding some kind of narrative that brings them more peace rather than more anguish, it's a big factor in grieving. And again, that is not automatically the case in quite the same way with other kinds of causes of death. There can be some overlap, of course. None of these things is unique only to suicide loss, but they definitely tend to be defining features.
Thank you. Now, how does religion and a person's culture influence how they grieve or how they respond to the death?
That is a very, very big and individual question, of course. Almost every major faith tradition historically has had some kind of prohibition against suicide. Almost every major faith tradition stigmatizes suicide. And the purpose of that stigma fundamentally was to be protective, right? You don't want the message from the faith community to be, oh, well, suicide is fine, right? So that stigmatization, the prohibition, was meant to be protective. The problem was that it overshoots the mark. And that prohibition and that stigmatization evolved in such a way that it stigmatized the person after death, and it also stigmatized the grieving family. And every major faith tradition has evolved very substantially in terms of how they view suicide. Almost every major faith tradition now understands suicide in the context of human suffering and or mental illness. And so I remember this man that I was at a conference with who told the story of being in the seminary studying to be a Jesuit priest when his father took his own life. And his siblings called him and said, can we bury dad in the same cemetery where mom is buried? Because he killed himself, and doesn't our faith teach that you're not allowed to bury people who took their lives in the same cemetery and with the same funeral rites as someone who died in some other way? And he tells a story about being in the seminary at the time that this happened and saying, I have no idea what the current teaching of my faith is. I need to look into it. And it turns out that almost every faith tradition's current view is much more humanistic and forgiving and compassionate, and much less legalistic and stigmatizing. How that affects an individual is all over the place. Some people find that in the aftermath of the suicide loss, their faith community or their religious leader are the thing that got them through, that they leaned on and felt held by. In other cases, particularly if the faith community gets it wrong, they'll never set foot in a house of worship again. So it varies. And sometimes people have a real crisis of faith initially and then find their way back to it. So it's very individual.
How does the healing process differ for people based on their relationship to the person who died by suicide, be it maybe your parent or a spouse or a sibling? Is there difference in grieving, different nuances?
There are some differences sometimes, and in other ways, there's a lot of similarities. So, for example, parents who lose a child, I've facilitated a lot of groups for mothers who've lost children to suicide. And parents who lose a child almost to a person will talk about how they'll say almost word for word, it was my job to keep my child safe. A parent's job is to keep their child safe, and I failed in that job. That's what they'll say. My responsibility is to help them look at that statement and explore whether that's actually true, whether it's actually true that you can keep someone else safe. And what does it mean to keep someone else safe? And is it actually really possible to do that, especially if their child was an adult, but frankly, even if their child was younger? And is it actually true that this suicide is a referendum on your parenting? Suicide is much more complicated than that. But it is very, very common for parents who've lost a child to be grappling with issues like that. It is very common for people who've lost a spouse or a partner to grapple with a lot of questions that relate to the fact that they chose each other and they were sharing a life together, and sometimes we're sharing a home together. So a lot of what people who've lost a spouse or a partner are grappling with is feeling that they should have seen something, that this is the person they were sharing their life with as an adult, and that they somehow missed something. The other thing that can come up with spouses and partners, particularly people who were married and had made a formal commitment to one another, and that you'll hear people say things like, we had a deal. We had a deal. And they didn't live up to their end of the bargain. So again, part of my responsibility is to help them explore with curiosity and compassion what the impact of suicide is on a relationship. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. People who've lost a sibling like I have are sometimes referred to as the forgotten mourners. So I remember so vividly how many people came up to me after my brother died and looked me square in the eye and said, "How's your mom doing?" And I remember thinking, not so great, but I'm not doing so great either. And I'm standing right here. And yet they would sort of look past me or over my head to be concerned about my mother. Not that my mother didn't deserve a lot of concern, but the implicit message was she must be suffering more. She must be more in need of support. People who've lost a parent, particularly if the parent died when the child was young, can have real feelings of abandonment. That the narrative of parents are supposed to take care of their children and they aren't here. And did they not love me enough to stay? And so again, part of my job is to help them explore that, because that's a very painful narrative to live in. So now all of what I just described, bits and pieces of it, can show up in lots of different relationships. People don't fall into perfectly neat categories, but there are definitely some themes that emerge. And it's one of the reasons why the groups that my organization runs are all based on relationship loss. So we have groups specific to mothers, specific to fathers, specific to siblings, because we have found that it can be very meaningful to connect with others who've shared exactly the same loss.
Are there differences in grieving between children, teens, and adults?
So there are some, but actually there are more similarities than differences. One of the things that I try to help people understand is that adults actually, if we let ourselves and trust our sort of inner psychological immune system to kick in and don't try to override it, we as adults grieve very similarly to how children grieve, which is that we toggle back and forth between immersing ourselves in the work of grieving and also having moments or periods where we are actually living our lives. And no one would ever say to an 8-year-old, get down off those monkey bars and get back home and cry because your father just died, right? We understand that children organically toggle back and forth between really feeling their grief and being a child, whether that means playing or being with their friends or going to focus on their schoolwork. And we don't second guess it and doubt it. When we as adults do that, when we realize, oh my God, I went to the movies and for 2 hours, I didn't think about my brother who died, we feel guilty about it. We feel like we've done something wrong. Or if it's been further from the loss and all of a sudden we notice that we're overwhelmed by a huge wave of grief, we panic and we think, oh my God, I thought I was past this by now. I've lost all the progress. The word progress always makes me pause a little bit because it puts so much pressure on us to feel like we're not doing it right. Kids and teens trust themselves much more, that they know what they need when they need it, and they don't tend to get in their heads as much. They don't second guess themselves. We have a teens group, and actually I just released a film focused on teens who've lost a parent or a sibling to suicide that's available free of charge. And a lot of the lessons that we learned from listening to the teens, we then turn around and teach the adults. Things like the teens will say, sometimes grieving feels like not feeling anything at all. Sometimes it feels like just being numb. And I don't know what to say because I don't even know what I feel. I just don't feel anything. Teens have told us that the suicide often, not always, but often is the culmination of a really complicated person, and the behavior and the family dynamics and things that were going on before the suicide are still going on after the suicide. And they remind us, yeah, my mom was a really tough person. I never knew which mom was going to come down the stairs. And I was already dealing with a really huge amount of complexity in my relationship with her. And now that she's dead, I'm still dealing with a huge amount of complexity. It just has different components to it. The teens, also what I said a few minutes ago about how it's so hard to miss someone and also be angry at them because they're the very person who killed your loved one. That came from the mouth of a 15-year-old in our teens group. So are there some differences? I'd say the primary difference is that the younger the griever, the more likely they are to seek out play as their way of grieving. But we are all of us human. And humans, if we trust them to seek out what they need and allow the process to be an organic one, all of us as humans can find our way through.
What are some of we've talked about some misconceptions, but what are some of the really big misconceptions people have about this type of grief that you see again and again?
Yeah. One misconception is that suicide has a straightforward, linear, easy explanation. And so much of what we as survivors of suicide loss are doing are trying to make sense out of it. But often what we're doing is we're dealing with people in the outside world who are asking us, why did this, oh my God, what happened, right? Why did this happen? Tell me. And so a lot of what is wrapped up both in the internal emotional experience of suicide loss, but also in the day-to-day interpersonal dealing with the outside world piece is this misunderstanding that, and the belief, which is incorrect, that suicide is caused by a very straightforward sort of catalyst. He killed himself because fill in the blank. His wife left him. He got fired. He got arrested. He was depressed. There is an effort on the part of the outside world to understand suicide based on what we can see. And although those factors are part of the picture, certainly, ultimately, when someone takes their own life, they're dying as a result of their own thoughts. It's not just the outside event that happened. It's what they're thinking about the event, but more importantly, about themselves that is what leads to suicide. And we don't have access to what other people are thinking. We only have access to what they tell us they're thinking. And even that is very incomplete. And so one of the biggest misconceptions is that suicide has an answer, has an explanation. Suicide is much, much more complex and nuanced than that.
What are some of the tools and resources that you found that are really effective for people grieving suicide loss?
So there are two resources that I point people to frequently. One is a website called Speaking of Suicide, speakingofsuicide.com. And I love that website because it's curated by a woman named Traci Arieli, who is both an expert in the research about suicide. She's also someone who has grappled with her own suicidality. And she's someone who writes in a very clear, effective way. And so her website is terrific one-stop shopping to really understand the phenomenon of suicide. Whether you're someone who's struggling yourself, you're a family member or you're a professional, a clinician or another professional. So that's one resource that I like a lot. Another resource that I recommend a lot is a book. It's available in paperback from Amazon. It's called When It Is Darkest. And the subtitle is something like What We Know About Suicide, something like that. But When It Is Darkest. And the author is Rory O'Connor. And the reason I love that book so much is that Rory is one of the leading researchers in the world when it comes to suicide. He's the president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention. He's British, and he's doing some of the most cutting edge research out there when it comes to suicide. So he's very, very knowledgeable. He's also someone who's grappled with his own suicidality. He's also someone who's lost people to suicide, and he's also someone who can write in a very human way. And so his book is grounded in the research and in the content, but it's presented in a very human, lay-friendly, accessible way. So it explains suicide in a way that we non-clinicians and non-researchers can really understand. So those are the resources that I like the most. In terms of tools, there are two that I find people really resonate with. One is this, I mentioned it a minute ago when we were talking about how children grieve. It's what's referred to in the research as the dual process model of grief. Dual as in two, not dual as in Aaron Burr, dual. And then when I share this with people that I work with, they often find it helpful. And that is that there are sort of two lanes that we deal with when we're grieving. One is all the stuff that we recognize as grieving, crying and really feeling the loss. That's the loss lane. And then the other lane is the restoration lane, which is everything else that we do in our lives to find ourselves again, whether it's laughing or going back to work or realizing that it's been a few minutes that I haven't thought about my loved one, or what all of the other things that we do that aren't actively grieving. And that humans organically toggle between the two. And it's not like driving a car where you can put your flicker on and choose what lane you want to be in, that the brain organically goes back and forth between the two. And knowing that it's part of the actual way the brain works, and it doesn't make you unloving that you forgot about your loss for 15 minutes, and it doesn't make you a failure because 10 years later, you're suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of grief, that actually we have an inner regulatory system that kicks in most people that functions in a really effective and important way. So that dual process, that's the tool that I share with people. And the other tool that I share a lot is what it means when we say everyone grieves differently, that's actually literally true. And there are some people whose grieving style is much more about communicating and connecting and expressing their emotion and being with other people. And there are other people for whom grieving is much more about reading and analyzing and being much more up in their heads, taking action, setting goals, doing projects, going back to work or school. And those different styles are not, one is not better than the other, but they can cause a lot of tension in families if people have very different styles. And so one of the tools that I invoke a lot is helping people really understand what it actually means when we say everyone grieves differently, and how to deal with people in your family whose style is very different from your own.
Very good. What are your thoughts about the social stigma we have around suicide, and really what can we be doing to change that? That's the real question. What can we do to change that stigma so that we have those tough conversations that we need to have?
So as we're sitting here right now, we just finished Suicide Prevention Month. And almost every survivor of suicide loss I know, excuse me, has very negative feelings about the language of suicide prevention. Not because we don't want suicide to be prevented, of course we do. But the message that suicide is preventable, like with a capital P that you put on a billboard or have Suicide Prevention Month, suggests that if we just get in there and say the right thing, we can prevent suicide, which means that if we lost someone to suicide, the implication is that we didn't do something right. And that feeling is the source of a huge amount of self-stigmatization, right? That somehow I failed. And that self-stigmatization then translates into stigma in the outside world. So we hear stories all the time about people who are in the grocery store and other people see them at the end of the aisle and avoid them. And what's implicit in that stigma is judgment, right? What did you do wrong? What's wrong with you or your family that someone took their own life? And to my mind, the way to begin to chip away at all of this is to message how complicated suicide is. But it's not about that suicide is preventable or not preventable. It's that suicide is really complicated, and that it's not just about figuring out the right thing to say to someone to convince them not to. Suicide is much, much more nuanced and complicated.
What advice would you give to someone who has lost someone to suicide, especially when they feel overwhelmed by guilt and anger?
So the first thing I would say is I would normalize it, that there is guilt and anger are human emotions. And the fact that you're feeling them is, we're gonna put those in the category of being true to the situation. That people often feel those emotions and then feel wrong for feeling them. They feel guilty for feeling angry. People will say things like, "Oh, well, there was nothing else you couldn't have done anything," and that is not comforting because they're going through the litany of all the things that they could have done. So the first thing I do is normalize that the fact that they're feeling those things is just part of their experience. And then the second thing I do is try to get underneath those feelings and really look at them, slow it down, because people tend, when they're so emotional, to connect dots really quickly and reach conclusions about the situation. And so what I try to do is slow it down. Let's untangle it piece by piece. And let's really look at what's underneath. So for example, anger is typically a secondary emotion. So just like orange is a secondary color, right? Red and yellow together make orange. Anger is a secondary emotion. And what's underneath anger is most commonly some combination of grief and sadness, fear or panic, helplessness, resentment, shame. Usually there are other things going on underneath the anger. And so what I try to do is help people get behind the scenes of the anger. What's really going on? So often what's going on behind anger when it comes to suicide loss is helplessness. I couldn't do any. This huge thing happened in my life. I didn't get a vote. I didn't get a warning. I didn't get veto power. And I'm now left with all of the pain and the anguish. And there is real sense of helplessness there and understandable anger. So the other thing I try to do, the word you use in your sentences when people are overwhelmed by guilt and anger and so on. So another thing that I try to do is help people cultivate a confidence that they can deal with the intensity of their feelings. Because often people are afraid to let those feelings in because they're afraid those emotions are going to be so powerful that they're going to knock them down and they're never going to be able to stand back up again. And so a lot of what I do is work with people to cultivate their own inner confidence that when those huge waves of emotion come, because they do, that they're not going to knock them down permanently, that they can weather those storms. And they're difficult and they're painful, but they're survivable.
Now, how can family and friends best support someone who has lost a loved one to suicide? Are there things that they should avoid saying and doing? What can they do?
So the things that people who've lost someone to suicide tend to worry about when it comes to outside, right? Comes to family and friends. They're worried that their loved one is going to be forgotten altogether. They're simultaneously worried that their loved one will be remembered, but will be remembered only because of the way they died. And so one of the most important things that family and friends can do is say the person's name. And if you didn't know the person's name, ask. Just like I did with you, right? What was their name? And then if you knew the person who died, share stories, share pictures, talk about the person. The same way we talk about other people in our lives who are not dead, right? Talk about the person, mention them by name, share stories. And if you didn't know the person, say, tell me about them. I want to know who this person was who mattered so much to you. So the single biggest thing friends and family can do is, if you knew the person who died, talk about them. And if you didn't know the person who died, be curious about them, be interested in who they were. The second piece of advice is, don't cross-examine survivors of suicide loss with questions about why it happened. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know. It's inappropriate and unfair to burden someone who's grieving with needing to explain to you what is inexplicable even to them. So it is human to be curious. Suicide often evokes a certain kind of morbid curiosity, frankly. And don't indulge that. Don't burden the person who's grieving with your curiosity. That's more of a weight than they need to carry. And the third thing that I suggest that people do is, instead of saying, if there's anything you need, just let me know, is to pick something specific that you're offering. Would it help if I took your kids to school every day for the next week? Would it help if I walked your dog? Would it help if I ordered you some groceries? The person who's grieving it's much easier for them to say yes or no than it is for them to come up with some idea of what they need and then summon the courage to ask for it. So if you offer something specific, the person is much more likely to say, oh, thanks, I've got Harpel taken care of, but you know what would really be helpful? Can you take my dog to the groomer, right? Or to say, oh, thanks, I'm all set with food, but you know what I'd love to just get out for a walk. So narrowing down the field of what you're offering can help the person say yes or no and help them clarify what it is that they actually do need. And then the final thing is, don't disappear. Everybody shows up right at the beginning. It's an all hands on deck situation. And then when everyone else goes back to their regular life, and it's 3 months or 6 months down the road, that's when it gets quiet. That's when you need to show up. And then the very final thing I would say is, put the anniversary of the death in your calendar. And when it's the anniversary, send a text or an email or a card or a phone call, whatever feels right, and say, I'm aware of the day. I'm thinking of you.
That's a wonderful thing to do. I think that after the year, people just forget. It's like, you've had the year, you should be over it.
Yeah.
And
my brother died 31 years. This summer was 31 years. And I still appreciate the people who acknowledge it too.
Thank you for sharing. And thank you so much for being here today, making yourself vulnerable. Your willingness to share is really appreciated. I know it will help so many people who are struggling with this type of loss.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. For anyone listening, how can they learn more about your work or get in touch with you?
So the easiest place is my website, which is copingaftersuicide.com, copingaftersuicide.com. I also am on Facebook under that same name and other social media, but really that's the very best place. And you can send a message to me right through the website. There's a little form on the website. It comes right to my desk. I believe in really personal attention, and so you can reach me very, very easily through the website.
Thank you. Folks, I know today's conversation was heavy. I hope it's given you something valuable to hold on to. If someone you love is grieving a suicide loss, remember there's no one right way to heal. It's a journey that takes time, and it's okay to reach out for support when you need it. If you're currently struggling with suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Hotline at 988. They are there to help you. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you've found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.